Hello and welcome to India's World. China's objections at the Vienna meeting of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or NSG, have temporarily put a question mark on India's chances of joining the group. The next opportunity to discuss India's membership will come at Seoul in South Korea at the plenary meeting of the NSG later this month. The Vienna meeting remained inconclusive despite strong support for India joining the Nuclear Trading Club, especially from the United States of America. The NSG controls access to sensitive nuclear technology. The 48 members of the NSG include the 5 nuclear weapon states: US, UK, France, China and Russia. The other 43 are signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. India is not a signatory to the NPT and calls it discriminatory. A number of countries which were initially opposed to India's bid on the ground that it was yet to sign the NPT eased their positions and were ready to work out a compromise. However, China stuck to its position that the NSG should not relax specific criteria for new applicants. To discuss India's attempt at being included in the NSG, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Rakesh Sood. He served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan and Nepal, but most importantly, he was also permanent representative to the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. He's a strategic affairs expert. Mr. Bharat Karnad, he's a research professor at Center for Policy Research and a national security expert. He's the author of 2 highly acclaimed books, India's Nuclear Policy and Nuclear Weapons in Indian Security, The Realist Foundations of Strategy. And we are lucky to have with us Commodore Uday Bhaskar, associated with several think tanks. He is the former director of Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. Commodore Bhaskar is one of India's leading experts and outspoken columnists on security and strategic affairs. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Rakesh, let me begin with you. How important is the membership of NSG for India's nuclear trade? Why does it matter to India so much?
Well, I personally think that the exceptional waiver that we received from the NSG in 2008 has enabled us to sign nearly a dozen agreements for supply of uranium as a fuel for our reactors. It has also enabled us to sign agreements with Russia, the United States and France for setting up new power reactors. So technically, it does not offer us anything in addition, except for the fact that because we have committed to observing NSG guidelines, if we are a participating government, they don't use the term member, if we are a participating government, then we will be involved in the decision making, as in when the meetings take place.
All right. Bharat Karnad, why is the US shepherding India's application for the membership of the NSG? Is it part of the commitment made earlier during the signing of the Indo-US Civilian Nuclear Cooperation Agreement that if India changed its export control regime to be in line with the major nuclear regimes that exist, that is NSG, MTCR, Wassenaar Agreement, Australia Group, then they would help us join these groups? Or do you think it's got to do with some other quid pro quo that may be coming in the future?
No, I think that's one part. The other part is just big power politics. The United States does want India on its side in what it sees as a coming competition with its rival and peer competitor China. And you have an interplay here of the United States and China right in the NSG, one pushing India's case, the other opposing it on what it says is principle. Now, the problem here is that, there is no resolution if China sticks to its stand. And it appears that in the Seoul meet, China will stick to its stand and we are not going to get in. So, the US's push for India's entry into this group really becomes infructuous if the Chinese resistance remains.
I understand that. I'm trying to understand the origins of American support for India's membership. Is it part of the commitment made during the signing of the civilian nuclear deal, or is it something more than that today?
No, look, the whole point about the nuclear deal was that the United States wanted India to be somehow dragged into the non-proliferation regime, somehow or the other. To the extent that the Indian government has, over the years, sought to be responsible and restrained, all these qualities that perhaps have a downside, and we have suffered from it. But the upside is that we do not then proliferate on our own. And this is one way of positive reinforcement, saying, look, you have acted responsibly, you have acted in a very restrained fashion to keep order, maintain order. And therefore, in some sense, we should welcome you into the group because you have not been disruptive. And that's an important thing, as a reward, as you may say.
Okay.
And this is the sort of thing that, in a sense, loops back into India's own belief in being a very cautious power.
Yeah. Okay. Commodore Uday Bhaskar, in 2008, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA Board of Governors approved Nuclear Safeguards Agreement with India, and shortly thereafter, NSG gave India a clean waiver, allowing it to trade in nuclear technology and materials. Now, how much nuclear trade has taken place after that waiver with the US, for example, which shepherded us there? And what I would like to know is India only a buyer of nuclear technology and materials, or has it also sold some nuclear technology and materials since then?
Going back to late 2008, when the NSG had accorded India this exceptional status, as Rakesh pointed out, it was an enabling provision. And subsequently, over the last 7 years roughly, we have been able to initiate a certain number of bilateral agreements, particularly for supplying uranium, which we need as the basic fuel for our reactors. There are the traditional nuclear suppliers with whom we have initiated these bilateral agreements. And some of them have made a certain amount of progress, because where there is only the supply of the basic, the yellow cake, that is proceeding at one level.
Yep.
Where we have had to engage in a higher level of nuclear commerce, the United States is a good example. The liability provisions of entering into a commercial agreement has also come into play. So that has had a different track. So I think for India, it's a very valid observation made by Ambassador Sood, that the de facto part has allowed India to progress whatever it deems appropriate for specifics. And the second part of your question, would it also help us to export? The answer is yes. And for that, I think
India, that I understand, it will help us to export. But have we exported anything, or have we just imported uranium from France, Canada, Kazakhstan, if you like?
As of now, our imports are greater in terms of the commitments we've made. But I do want to flag the export part, saying that once India is accorded not just the de facto, but you are admitted into the NSG, then you also become part of the management. And for a number of developing countries where India may be in a position, for instance, nuclear safety is one of India's, I would say, USPs in terms of the cost factor. It's not as if the 5 nuclear powers do not have their own safety record, but you speak to the professionals, especially for countries that are embarking upon civilian nuclear energy, we do bring certain skill sets to the table, and that would be governed or managed by the larger ambit of the NSG. So therefore, I think for India, this membership, you flagged the point that China is going to perhaps play a spoiler's role. It does have a certain value. And therefore, I think India should be pitching to see how best to enter the NSG and have that particular membership, which, as I said, then you become part of the management, as it were.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll continue with this discussion in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing India's attempts at becoming member of the National Nuclear Suppliers Group. I beg your pardon. Bharat Karnad, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I was just saying that India has mastery over 3 fuel cycles, thorium, uranium and plutonium. Now, the thing is that we have always had technologies to sell. And we could have sold them outside of the NSG. NSG is not required, was never required for us to sell our goods. Sure, if the supply countries wanted it within the ambit of NSG, that's a separate thing. But there was no requirement for us to join the NSG to export our nuclear materials that we have indigenously developed. The reason we haven't done it...
Would that not be called proliferation?
No. The reason, not civil nuclear power plants. For instance, the Indu reactor is a separate genus of the CANDU that we originally got from the Canadians. Built on the NRX reactor. Now, the point is that why have we not sold these indigenously developed reactors? Because most supply countries also provide the finance. We haven't had the resources to provide the financing for countries who are otherwise very interested in buying our reactors.
Okay. You wanted to say something?
Well, I think the point here is that while we don't need an NSG membership to be able to sell nuclear technology, whether it is power reactors or research reactors, but I think you mentioned that whether or not it would be considered quote-unquote proliferation. Now, that because we are not part of an established nuclear regime, obviously we can't be part of the NPT, given that we are a nuclear weapon state. I think to that extent, it changes the optics if we sell these technologies as a member of the nuclear suppliers group.
Yep.
So in that sense, it improves the optics of the transaction.
Bharat, coming to you again. What do you think of the Chinese concern that NSG members must be signatories of NPT? France wasn't a member of NPT when it joined NSG, so why this criteria for India?
The Chinese is really very rich of Beijing to impose this condition on India's entry into NSG, considering it has been the prime proliferator and the most deliberate manner has disrupted the non-proliferation regime. I mean, India had every incentive to do so, but we refrained from doing so. China had no incentive. It just got entry. And yet it is the most disruptive element, the biggest proliferator, is the part of a rogue nuclear triad right now that involves Pakistan and North Korea as the prime driver of proliferation in the world. So it's very rich for Beijing to say that India should adhere to the NPT norms.
What do you think of the other two Chinese objections, Commodore?
I just want to very adly...
do add, but let me finish. Because that's not the only objection. They also say that no country-specific exception should be given, especially given that Pakistan applied for membership of NSG 1 week after India. And two, NSG decision should not change the South Asian balance.
I just want to add quickly saying that perhaps we are looking for the Chinese word for chutzpah, meaning that the way in which the Chinese have conducted themselves over the decades, including their opposition to the NPT before they became members to where we are now, I think this is a very, very interesting tactical position they've taken. And in relation, I think, to the conditions that they have suggested, signature of NPT, for instance, I still maintain it is tactical. Because hypothetically, if there is some macro deal which says that, okay, India will come in and the United States gives a signal saying that we will not prevent Pakistan, then the fact that India and Pakistan have not signed the NPT would be waived, meaning that you come back to the political compulsion when we are looking at the nuclear issue. And a last point, Bharat, all this business about we must have certain norms for admitting new members, this was already dealt with in 2008, saying India has a track record of 3 decades. Let that be the principle. Let Pakistan match India's track record of 3 decades of quote-unquote responsible behavior, then the application can be considered. So I would say China is tactical.
Okay. Rakesh, if India is admitted to the NSG, would it also dehyphenate it from Pakistan? And is this why China is insisting that if India gets NSG membership, so should Pakistan?
Yes, although quite frankly, Pakistan's potential membership to the NSG does not really change anything because it gets the cooperation from China, as Bharat pointed out, with or without any restraints, because China is prepared to deal with Pakistan in a special manner. So Pakistan is essentially seeking parity, and China is supporting Pakistan's search for parity with India.
So is the Chinese demand to include Pakistan in NSG merely a demand to create hurdles for India? Is it a realistic demand that, don't change the balance?
It's completely unrealistic. It is hypocritical. There is no way India can sign the NPT, nor is there any way in which Pakistan can sign the NPT for that matter. So it is completely...
But as Commodore Uday Bhaskar said, hypothetically, if both become members, then the NPT requirement is really not there.
Well, exactly. And to add to it, the idea that there should be a process or there should be a criteria-based approach also does not hold water, because today there are only 5 countries that are outside the NPT. India, Pakistan, Israel is not interested in becoming a member of the NSG, and you have North Korea, which is a different case altogether, and you have South Sudan, which is a new country. So frankly, there are only 2 countries that are interested in joining the NSG that have indicated an interest, and that's India and Pakistan. And there is really no way you can have a process because the track records are completely different.
Okay. Bharat, do you think India's direct pitch with China, because India did make a direct pitch at the highest level, at the level of our foreign secretary talking to the foreign minister, etc., has not worked because of India's growing closeness to the United States on China's China, US, Japan standoff in the South China Sea?
Well, look, there is the US-China angle and there's the China-India angle. And the imperatives for China are essentially to hyphenate India and Pakistan to ensure that India stays contained to the subcontinent. Because once it's equated with Pakistan, its status is reduced. It is just a subcontinental power.
So that's why it talks of South Asian balance, not the Asian balance.
That's right. And now our interest is to have an Asian balance. And that's where all the other players come in. Japan, the rimland states that we would like to have coalition with, and including the United States as an extraterritorial balancer. So this is the sort of balancing act, the two balancing acts that are really facing each other. Now, as has been said, China, given the fact that it has always gained, already gained entry, whether it's the Security Council, whether it's NSG or anything else, it can now decide, and because most of these bodies work on the principle of consensus, and so each member has a veto, it feels free to use its veto to advance its larger political design.
Would you like to add something?
Just to say that I think one of the other strands which cause anxiety in China is that if India is in, then India also becomes a voice in the collective of the NSG, and many of China's activities, which really are, I think, contributing to proliferation, and we've drawn attention to the China-Pakistan, as also the AQ Khan, which hasn't come up for discussion, all these would perhaps come under scrutiny if India were to raise them. So therefore, I think there is a clear case why China does not want India in the NSG, and it is using any which reason to prevent India. But again, this I think we would know by the end of the month.
All right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back with you in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing India's quest for membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Bharat Karnad, what do you think of the Chinese argument that every case dealing with India's nuclear status up to now has been ad hoc in nature and dependent on exceptionalism of the Indian case?
Well, because I think in some sense India is exceptional. I mean, we reached weapons threshold in 1964. It was a self-willed, shall we say, exclusionary policy. No one imposed, no one sort of, prevented us from becoming a weapons power. We decided we wouldn't. As I see it, it was a wrong decision to make. Had we gone ahead and done it, instead of being idealistic and so on, we'd be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Now, the thing is that this is precisely what has hindered India's progress, as it were, in the nuclear realm. But that said, for China, it's a golden opportunity to hamper India's recognition of India as a nuclear weapon state, as a bona fide power in the great power politics and so on and so forth. Then that's why, if you hear Beijing's rhetoric, they keep distinguishing themselves from India, and they keep putting down India as a lesser power. You should concern yourself with South Asia and not think big. Yeah. So it helps them in that quest to reduce India, even as they inflate themselves as a peer competitor to the United States.
Okay. Rakesh, while the Chinese invoke a more rule-based approach to membership of the NSG, isn't the membership of the NSG by definition country-specific and one of case-by-case basis?
Absolutely. In fact, the NSG did not start out with 48 member states, or as I had mentioned earlier, 48 participating governments. And there are only technical criteria, because the NSG is not a treaty-based organization. It is a guideline-based entity of participating governments, technically. So therefore, it has worked on having countries admitted to the NSG as participating governments on a case-by-case basis. And it is only now that the non-proliferationists and China, some of them, they are talking of a process or a criteria-based approach.
But criteria-based approach can also be case-by-case.
Yeah, absolutely.
As long as you do not keep inventing new criteria each time.
And as I mentioned earlier, there are only 2 countries that are interested. The other 3 who are outside the NPT are not interested in becoming members of the Nuclear Suppliers Group.
Okay, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, what do you think of the Pakistani argument that giving India easy access to fissile material and technology when it becomes member of the NSG, that is for the civilian program, will free up existing resources for its military program, and therefore it will create a military imbalance?
I would say, Bharat, it's a very predictable position. because traditionally, I think going back to May 1998 and subsequent to both countries becoming de facto nuclear weapon powers, Pakistan has constantly tried to draw attention and at one level seek parity and concurrently, I think, play up this anxiety and go back to that old argument that South Asia is the most dangerous because of India. The reality is quite different, and that is where I think we have to sort of read between the lines, that today Pakistan is the only country that has two tracks for the weapon, both the plutonium and the uranium. And some estimates place the Pakistani inventory at a higher quantitative level than India. But yet, they want to advance this narrative. And very interestingly, it always happens when there is some major event. Prime Minister Modi going to the United States. So all these flares are lit up. But I think the professionals understand, and even within the NSG, I gather, there are many countries who are very uneasy about the way in which Pakistan is now positioning itself.
Bharat, but hasn't Pakistan opposed signing the fissile material cutoff treaty? If they're so bothered about proliferation of fissile material, why don't they sign the FMCT?
No, look, the Pakistani position, as I understand it, is that all the countries have to account for all the fissile material they have in their stockpile. Yeah. Now, that's precisely what, say, India or many other countries are against doing. Whether that's right or not is a separate matter. It's not a value judgment. But the fact is that the Pakistanis insist, particularly with respect to India, that we disclose the extent of our stockpile of fissile material that they believe can be easily converted to weapons, and that's the real metric to judge India's capability.
Yeah, you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say, Bharat, actually there is no such thing as a fissile material cutoff treaty that exists. What we've been talking about for more than a decade is actually beginning negotiations for a possible future fissile material cutoff treaty. Yeah. And what Pakistan has done consistently is hold up these negotiations for over a decade. So we don't really have, and meanwhile, as we've talked about the fact that Pakistan has been building up both its fissile material stocks, both in terms of highly enriched uranium as well as plutonium.
Yeah. Bharat, is it reflective of the changing power equation between the US and China that in 2008, President George W. Bush could pick up the phone and talk to the Chinese president and get India the exceptional waiver in NSG? Today, President Barack Obama cannot do the same because of various kinds of standoffs that exist between US and China.
Yes, there is a relative decline in US power. There's no question about it. That's the reason also why there's such great, such rather increased interest in the US to have India on its side, and the kind of attempts it's trying to make to get Delhi working with Washington. So that's, of course, the interest to try to balance out. But then equally, I don't think the Chinese have reckoned with the kind of correlation of forces that are emerging in Asia that are simply not willing to step back. And there's going to be a pushback, actually, on China in Southeast Asia. That's happening. You saw what happened in the Shangri-La summit just last week. Many of the Southeast Asian, Philippines, for instance, Vietnam, for another, very, very open in saying they will not permit the Chinese to impose their claims by force, and that China would have to agree to the Hague decisions on the law of the seas and the demarcation, not along the 9-dash line claims, but along more reasonable UNCLOS parameters.
Yeah, but it might help India in a broader sense, but in the case of NSG membership, this is immaterial. It just shows that there are other people who are also opposed to China.
Yes.
Yes, but I think here China is also pushing it because Pakistan has put in its application. Yeah. Now in 2008 that was not the case. So today China therefore has an additional argument to put forward saying, okay, there are two candidates.
Yeah. But America is also putting forward that argument, except from the leaked letter of US Secretary of State John Kerry indicate that India may not oppose ultimately Pakistan's membership of the NSG. Because India has given an assurance that it will take a merit-based approach and will not oppose membership of Pakistan on the basis of regional issues it might have with Pakistan. So do you foresee a time where India becomes a member and then subsequently, sequentially, Pakistan also becomes a member of NSG?
Well, I mean, I would say it is a possibility, and I think in the run-up to the meeting in Vienna, there have been various balloons that have been floated. Yeah. And I think at this point in time, if you look at the way in which India has been admitted into the MTCR and the kind of what you might call as informal support that has been extended, even by countries which in the past had taken a different position. Mexico is a good example. And if New Zealand comes on board, because earlier they had taken very strong positions about nuclear issues in a very, you might say, generic sense. So I think by and large the support for India is greater, and this I think would be a reflection of India's long-term assessment that once we get in, will we enable Pakistan to come on board as a normative player? That's the question mark.
Would Pakistan join subsequently and India will not object?
Well, that remains a political decision of the government at the time. One cannot predict. But of course, it eases their path in a sense.
Okay.
It is certainly a way out, and I think Chinese would have looked at the fact that how India has finished its MTCR membership. Incidentally, China's application for MTCR membership is pending. So I'm sure China will also take that factor into account in the run-up to the plenary meeting in Seoul.
Okay, we've run out of time. I would like to thank all of you, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Mr. Bharat Karnad, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.